I changed the title. I'm sorry, Leanne, because it was after the deadline. We'll talk about how to live your best life, but we'll also talk a little bit about power. So about 6 months ago, I spoke at the Lesbians Who Tech SF Summit, and by all accounts, it was a success. One, I didn't die, which was my initial fear, but two, I received one of the first and only standing ovations of my short life, and then three, I was able to pass on the message of channeling the confidence of mediocre white men whenever you feel in doubt. The message still rings true, which is good to hear. Unfortunately and sadly, that same day, my aunt passed away. And I was both sad to lose her, but happy that she was finally at peace. But I also, beyond feeling guilt or grief, which you would expect, I found myself overcome with this feeling of guilt. Guilt that I wasn't there with her in the last days, guilt that I still had my mom and my cousin, who in many ways is like a sister, didn't have her mother, and also guilt that I felt really good that speech had gone well. And I wish that I could tell you that guilt was a new feeling, but it wasn't. It was quite familiar. It was the same guilt I felt in my first semester at Yale when my mother called me and told me that my cousin, who was only 2 years older than me, had been shot and killed in Chicago. It's the same guilt that I feel every day when I live my life in Seattle. And for those of you who haven't visited the Pacific Northwest, it's like a millennial wonderland. I'm hiking, I'm on my bike, I'm like running with my dog, my girlfriend and I are living our best life, but it's very different from the life of my family who's still in Chicago, which is a city with one of the highest murder rates in the country. And not only do they live in Chicago, they live on the west side of Chicago, which is a neighborhood in a city that's already quite dangerous. It's one of the highest murder rates within that city. So what do? I know those particular traumas and tragedies are my own, but I can't help but to believe that you all have felt similar feelings. Perhaps because our news feeds are constantly showing us national tragedies and traumas every day. Or perhaps because we are so privileged as members of the LGBT community to be able to come to an incredible conference like Lesbians Who Tech, but at the same time, homelessness amongst queer youth is going through the roof. And we all carry in our hearts the tragedy of Orlando still. And despite the fact that many workplaces where we may ourselves work have trans rights protections, this year has been one of the deadliest on record for our trans sisters, particularly our trans sisters of color. Makes you want to holler. What do? And for me, as a product manager, I think a lot about questions. And I thought a lot about why, as I was living my best life, this really incredible life, there was a shadow of guilt over it. And I found myself turning on two questions over and over. Why me? What did I do to deserve this incredible life? I'm smart, but let me tell you, some of the smartest people you'll meet are on the west side of Chicago. I'm hardworking, but if you have ever dealt with homelessness or home insecurity, you know that it's hard work. So why me? What did I do to deserve this? Why not me? Why did I get to come home? Why did I get to come home this night? Why do I get to live, and why do I get to live with so much when there's so many who have so little? But those are the wrong questions, and I felt those to be the wrong questions, but I couldn't figure out what were the right questions I should be asking myself. So I went to the patron saint of every black lesbian, Audre Lorde, and perhaps every lesbian, and she gave me some better questions. And she wrote this poem called Need, a Choral of Black Women's Voices in the 70s when she saw an epidemic of black women being murdered nationally and no news of it in any newspaper, which, the more things change. And she asked these two questions, which are, how much of this truth can I bear to see and still live unblinded? How much of this pain can I use? And those questions were a breakthrough for me because that first question helped articulate this thing that I had felt, which is I don't want to live a blinded life. Because my life is good, I don't want to pretend as if that's true for every member of my community or my communities. But at the same time, I don't want to sit in that pain, that feeling of guilt. How much of this pain can I use? And so I went from this feeling of guilt, which in many ways is narcissistic and self-serving and only doesn't help you or the people around you, to this feeling of responsibility. Most important, reasonable responsibility, because too much can be overwhelming and counterproductive, as we all may have experienced. And I did a couple things. First is I channeled a bunch of energy into a hackathon called Black to the Future that we did in March. And I cannot tell you how incredibly gratifying and healing it was to watch over 100 black folks in technology, out of technology, and allies come together to think through how do we imagine and reimagine what the future of our communities can be and what role technology can play in that. It was incredible. Shout out to you. Your energy is incredible. I see you. Thank you. I really tell you that it was an incredible feeling. But one thing I also did was to start where I could, which was in tech. And so I started with a couple of friends working on this passion project that we're still developing called the Commonwealth App, which seeks to bring 1 million jobs to the black community. And we're going to do so based on this simple fact, that if affluent blacks, like myself, spent 1 out of every $10 with a black-owned business, it would create 1 million jobs. And I think often, shout out to that, I think often about what 1 million jobs could do to change the west side of Chicago and the many places around the country like it. But I'm not alone. There are others. A good friend of mine in Seattle, Thomas Phillips, from Detroit, a city not unlike Chicago, he wants to transform Detroit and empower youth by retrofitting school buses and making them into rolling coding labs. Which is an awesome idea. You should absolutely look up what he's doing and how he can support, because he's seen in his life as a youth from Detroit how tech has totally changed it, and he wants to give back. Or even the founder of the Black Joy Project, whose many friends in the Black Lives Matter movement were overwhelmed by grief, rightfully so, and who just took a simple start to start photographing Black joy, because that too is resistance. So what will you do? Will you donate to the Edie Windsor Coding Scholarship? Hopefully, if you haven't done so already. Send some needed supplies to Standing Rock protesters who I believe are fighting for water rights for all of us. Will you initiate a conversation at your place of employment about not just diversity, but inclusion and equity? Will you mentor? Yes, let's do it. Will you mentor or perhaps even foster, this is actually a personal goal, perhaps even foster a homeless queer youth? Or maybe you'll do all of the above or none of the above. But here's the reality. Times are hard, and I know that our modern identities can sometimes make them even harder, because our identities aren't simple, right? Like, on one hand, I am incredibly privileged. I have 2 Ivy League degrees. I've worked at some of the top tech companies in this country. But on the other hand, I also come from the west side of Chicago, and I hold the pain and trauma of that community at my heart's very core. So what do? The answer that I hold in my heart still, and that drives me forward every day, comes from Mama Audrey again. And she has this poem, which I love, called For Each of You. And the first stanza, I think, really epitomizes how I navigate this sometimes sticky road of survivor's guilt, which is, be who you are and will be. Learn to cherish that boisterous black angel that drives you, up one day and down another, protecting the place where your power rises, running like hot blood from the same source as your pain. And my hope, my dream, and my wish for each of you here today is that you will always protect the place where your power rises, and you will let that power rise daily, because the world needs it. Thank you.